Hello everyone. If your day has been long, if your mind still hums with the noise of errands and screens, let this be the quiet after. Set it all down for a while. Breathe in, slowly, and let it fall away. Tonight, we'll wander softly into a story from ancient Rome told not to judge, not to thrill, but to rest with. It is a bedtime history story, the kind that drifts like candlelight across stone corridors and sleeping gardens. We'll follow the life of one who rose higher than anyone imagined and fell further than words could hold. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. History remembers him as Caligula, but before the cruelty, before the legend, there was simply a child in little boots walking beside his father's soldiers under the Rhine fog. This is not a tale of madness tonight, but of how power can shift the soul slowly, quietly, until even memory trembles to understand it. A piece of relaxing historical storytelling, shaped not for argument but for reflection, for the calm curiosity that lingers before sleep. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps a small apartment with the window cracked open to rain, or a quiet room where only the hum of night remains. Tell me in the comments. I like to know who else drifts through these hours with me. And if these soft-spoken history sleep stories bring you peace, you can subscribe and return whenever the world feels too loud. Now, close your eyes. Let the breath slow. A door opens toward another time, not brighter, only calmer. Together, we step into history, gently, like moonlight finding its way across the stones of Rome. Night settles over Rome the way a shawl settles over tired shoulders, slowly, kindly, without hurry. The city that roared by day exhales into quiet. Market awnings are tied down, amphorae rolled against walls, doorways swept of dust that will return tomorrow. Across the Tiber, water goes on speaking in its soft, patient language, slipping past the embankments, past the shadows of arches that look black and weightless in the moonlight. On the Palatine Hill, a few remaining lamps keep their small promises, each flame a held breath, each window a warm square cut from the dark. This is the hour we choose for listening, not for debate or verdicts, but for the gentler art of presence, as if the past were a guest who arrives after supper, sits near the coals, and tells a quiet story without raising its voice. We do not come to conquer this night with facts. We come to rest among them. We let the stones speak first. We let the river set the pace. Somewhere below the sleeping palaces, a courtyard keeps the last heat of the day. Fig leaves hold a faint sweetness. A cat steps between two columns and disappears. Far off, a guard's sandal scuffs once, then stops. The city drifts, and with it our thoughts. If there is worry left in you, set it down here for a while. Let the cool air carry it to the trees on the Aventine, where wind unknots what people cannot. Your breathing belongs to you again. Tonight we open a quiet door into the life of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, whom history remembers by a name that began as a kindness, a nickname given by men who smiled when they saw him. Caligula, Little Boot. Before the noise and rumor, before the stories were sharpened and repeated until they cut, there was a child walking beside his father's soldiers. Imagine a frontier camp on the Rhine, wet canvas sighing in the night, lines of spearheads asleep under oiled cloth, watchfires making a plain of red stars on the ground. The boy's steps are small, but the boots are real. Miniature Caligulae stitched with care, the leather softened and blackened by hands that understood both war and tenderness. The soldiers laugh softly when he passes, not to mock, but the way men laugh when life surprises them with gentleness in a hard place. His father is Germanicus, beloved of Rome, a figure not only of victories but of a certain grace that soldiers remember long after the orders fade. Near him walks Agrippina the Elder, strong-backed, observant, the kind of mother who studies a horizon as if it were a page. The tents hold families of a sort, craftsmen, servants, the drifts of daily living that follow an army wherever it stops to breathe. In that traveling village, the boy learns the map of faces, the medic with the quiet hands, the standard bearer who hums the same narrow tune when he oils the eagle, the cook who tests porridge with a slow solemnity that makes the others smile. He learns the language of weather, the sudden slap of rain off the river, the white breath of horses at dawn. We pause here, not because we cannot go on, but because this is a precious stillness, the last uncomplicated place. It is easy to hurry past it, to race into the shadowed corridors where power changes shape. But tonight, we set a different pace. We are not building a case, we are keeping company. We honor the tender, ordinary hours that every life is made of, and that most histories forget. Hands tying laces, a father adjusting a strap so it won't rub, a child tracing the pattern of hobnails in the dust with a stick. In Rome, years later, that nickname will sound like a warning bell, but at the beginning, it is simply love made into a sound. Caligula, little boot. In the camp it means the boy who walked with us, the boy we teased with warmth, the one we lifted up to see the flooded meadow where wild geese slept like scattered pillows. It means the child who learned to listen to the drumbeat of feet on wooden bridges and to the soft, important silences between orders. The moon slides out from a shawl of cloud. On the Palatine, a household slave pinches a wick, then changes his mind and lets the lamp burn a little longer. Somewhere, a lute offers 4 notes to no one in particular, then rests. The city's pulse is very slow now, almost the pace of sleep. History, too, asks for rest. It will speak more tomorrow. There is time. The aqueducts murmur like long sentences comforting themselves. The paving stones hold the day's heat in their cores, sighing it back into the air like a story told twice. We do not have to decide anything tonight. We do not have to defend or condemn. We may acknowledge that power, like weather, travels in systems wider than any one life. We may also remember that each life begins with the same small things: shoes tied, doors opened, someone's hand briefly on the shoulder to guide, to steady. Even the famous carry their beginnings with them, the grain of kindnesses, the texture of sleepless nights by a river that kept talking when everyone else had fallen quiet. If you listen closely, you can hear the camp again. A leather thong tightened, the metallic thrum of a tent rope plucked like a low string, the boy's breath when he concentrates on not stumbling. He is not yet an emperor. He is not yet a story sharpened to a point. He is a child in boots, in a long, cold place, and he is safe for now. Let the night keep him a little longer. Let Rome rest. Let the river go on with its soft argument against hurry. In the next part, we will follow the small figure more closely through tents and watchfires, along the river path where a father once slowed his stride so a child could catch up. For now, you may close your eyes if you wish. Breathe at the pace of the water. The lamps on the hill are steady. The city is listening with you. Morning rises pale along the Rhine, not so much dawn as a slow lifting of breath. The mist clings low over the camps, wrapping the spears, the ropes, the horses' flanks in a softness the soldiers never quite get used to. From a distance, the tents look like islands, adrift on milk-white water. Inside, the smell of oil and leather, of bread warming on coals, tells of another day that must begin. Here, in this shifting world of campaigns and encampments, the boy moves easily among men who once marched through fire. He is no stranger to the clang of metal or the bark of Latin orders, yet around him the roughest hearts soften. They call him Caligula, little boot. The name makes him laugh the first time he hears it, and the sound is such a fragile, unguarded thing that the men turn away, pretending not to notice how it moves them. The nickname spreads through the camp like the warmth from a brazier. Simple, human, indelible. His father, Germanicus, walks the rows before sunrise. He is the kind of leader soldiers follow, even when no one is watching, a man who speaks more with his eyes than his voice. When he passes, men straighten not from fear, but from something quieter, the instinct to be worthy of respect, freely given. Behind him, the boy follows, steps quick to match his father's long stride, the tiny boots leaving brief prints in the damp earth. Germanicus pretends not to notice the effort, though once or twice he slows, turning a pace into a pause, giving the child time to draw even. Those small mercies, unnoticed by most, are what his soldiers will remember longest. Agrippina the elder keeps the household steady, a woman carved from patience and pride. She carries the dignity of Rome in the set of her shoulders, but her eyes are always searching for her son among the tents. When she finds him, mud on his hem, a pebble clutched as treasure, her scolding comes softened by relief. She kneels, cleans the dust from his cheek with her thumb, and says nothing about the chill creeping into her fingers. In her heart, she knows that childhood is brief in such places, and every hour of innocence is a gift easily lost. The camp wakes in layers. First the cough of the watchman, then the murmured prayers, then the rhythmic striking of flints. Smoke rises, carrying the smell of barley and boiled herbs. Trumpets sound low, not for battle, only to gather. Horses stamp and snort, restless against their ropes. To the boy, the sounds form a kind of song. He knows the pattern, the slow drums of the march, the whispered orders, the clatter that becomes heartbeat. To fall asleep, he listens for those same echoes, the lullaby of discipline and motion footsteps, breathing, fire crackling in rhythm with the wind. Sometimes Germanicus lifts him onto the wall at dusk, so he can see the river turning to silver under the dying Sunday. Remember this, his father murmurs. Even rivers obey the land. The boy nods, though he does not yet understand. Later he will recall only the warmth of a large hand steadying his shoulder, the faint scent of iron and pine, and the soft hiss of the Rhine against its stones. The soldiers teach him small things: how to polish a clasp, how to pack a kit, how to read the direction of wind by the tremor of a torch flame. Each man becomes a tutor of a single, simple truth, that even in war, there are gestures of care that make the day bearable. One shows him how to braid leather, another how to whistle through his fingers, another how to fall and roll without scraping the palms. He collects these lessons the way children elsewhere collect marbles or shells, not knowing they are already shaping the language of his body. When the light fades, the camp glows with 100 watchfires. Shadows grow long. The noise of the day thins to murmurs and laughter. From one tent comes the creak of a lyre, from another the rasp of a whetstone. Someone tells a joke about senators who've never seen mud. Someone else hums a lullaby from a province far away. The boy sits between two soldiers, legs folded, hands warmed over the coals. His eyes follow sparks as they rise, vanish, and are replaced as endless as breath itself. To the men, he becomes something like a charm, a reminder of sons waiting at home, of futures still possible. They guard him with the same instinct they guard their standards. When danger looms, he is ushered into the inner tent, where Agrippina waits, calm but alert. She teaches him to listen for silence, the moment just before news arrives. He listens, and the silence teaches him back. In this rhythm of march and rest, the boy grows without noticing. The river marks his seasons. Each winter, the mist comes thicker. Each spring, the mud dries a little sooner. He learns to read the moods of soldiers, as others read weather. The hush before good news, the sigh before despair. There are nights when he dreams of Rome, a place he barely knows, shimmering in imagination like the reflection of stars in water. To him, home is wherever the fires burn in orderly rows, wherever his parents' voices can be heard through the tent cloth, speaking softly after the duties of the day. For now, the world is safe enough. The boots are still small, the name still tender. Beyond the river, forests breathe in darkness, but they keep their distance. Inside the camp, warmth gathers, the kind made not of heat, but of human closeness. Germanicus bends over a map, tracing lines no one can yet see. Agrippina writes by lamplight, her words steady and spare. Between them, the child sleeps, one hand curled around the tiny boots that tomorrow will walk again through dew and laughter. And the Rhine keeps its long song, winding past their dreams, a lullaby of water, of distance, of time moving gently forward. Evening settles differently in Rome than it does along the Rhine. Here, the air holds the color of bronze left in the sun, too long, warm, dim, a little tired. The empire itself seems to breathe out after a long century of triumph. Statues of Augustus still catch the fading light, their marble faces calm, their eyes turned toward eternity. But behind the calm, something shifts. The age of the founder has become memory. The glow that once filled the world now thins, like gold dust settling in water. In this afterlight, the city moves more carefully. The streets still teem, the markets still hum, but there is a pause in the way people speak his name. Augustus, they say, softer now, as though not to wake him. His rule had given Rome a long peace, a kind of order that made even war seem far away. Yet peace carries its own hunger. What happens when the father of the empire finally rests, and the sons begin to measure the shadows he left behind? Tiberius steps forward, not so much chosen as required, a man pulled by duty rather than desire. He has the posture of someone who would rather stand in the background but knows the stage has found him. He inherits not only power, but the silence of a city unsure whether to cheer. Where Augustus once inspired love, Tiberius inspires caution. He rules through steadiness, through the weight of command, through that strange Roman virtue that mistakes restraint for virtue itself. In the imperial household, the threads tighten, decisions are whispered, names weighed like coins. Germanicus, beloved by legions, becomes the bright star within this quieter sky. He is everything Rome still wishes to believe about itself. Noble, brave, merciful. He fights not only with discipline but with warmth, a general who knows that soldiers march best when they are seen as men. And so Rome looks to him, gently, hopefully, as if the empire could have a conscience again. The boy Caligula grows in the shadow of these currents, too young to understand, but old enough to feel them. He hears his father's name spoken with pride by men who pass their cups around the fire. He also hears it murmured in darker corners, where courtiers lower their voices, aware that praise can be dangerous when envy listens nearby. Agrippina notices more than she says. She has learned that women in palaces survive by silence and exact memory. At night, she writes letters not of gossip or complaint, but of witness. She records the faces of those who smile too quickly, the phrasing of decrees, the tone of the herald's voice. Each word becomes a quiet protection for the family she guards like a temple flame. Germanicus, meanwhile, continues his work in the provinces, sending reports written in that clear, unfussy Latin that speaks of order and fairness. His dispatches are filled not with conquest but with rebuilding, diplomacy, and care for the people under Rome's wing. There are feasts in the city to honor him. Musicians play, senators toast, poets weave comparisons between Germanicus and the young gods. Even Tiberius smiles, thinly, the way one does when duty requires. In public, he praises the general's achievements. In private, he measures the applause and finds it too loud. Such things happen quietly in Rome, not as thunderclaps, but as weather shifting behind the hills. Across the empire, omens continue as they always have. Comets passing, birds crossing the wrong direction, the sudden stillness of wind before a speech. Superstition is the soft language of politics. People listen to it because it feels safer than truth. Germanicus himself pays little heed to such whispers. When soldiers kneel for augury, he stands apart, watching the horizon, thinking only of the Rhine fog, the sound of his son's laughter, carried by river air. Back in the capital, marble gleams under torchlight. The Senate debates the tribute of distant provinces. In one courtyard, a statue of Augustus casts its long evening shadow across a pool where leaves float, drifting slowly in circles. The guards at the palace gates change watch. The clink of their armor echoes like a slow metronome marking time between one age and the next. The people still say that Augustus found Rome in brick and left it marble. Yet marble cools. It remembers the touch of sunlight long after the sun has gone. That is where Rome finds itself now, in the cooling glow of greatness, learning to live by reflection rather than flame. And within that glow, somewhere between admiration and unease, a young boy listens to the conversations of adults who believe he isn't paying attention. He watches how glances last half a heartbeat longer than they should. He feels how silence thickens when someone says, "Tiberius." Childhood teaches more than language. It teaches atmosphere. Caligula learns the weather of power long before he learns its rules. The empire turns, as it always does, slowly, invisibly, with the inevitability of tide. In the dusk of one emperor and the dawn of another, all of Rome seems to hold its breath. The torches burn steady, the marble glows, the future waits quietly in the corridor. Autumn came to the east with a strange quiet. The wind over Syria did not howl. It sighed, as though carrying a burden too delicate for noise. Germanicus, the golden general of Rome, had arrived in Antioch, a city of white dust and sun-polished stone, to settle disputes and restore calm to the empire's restless provinces. He was tired, though he would never admit it. Years of campaigns had etched fine shadows at the corners of his eyes, but when he walked through the streets, the people still greeted him as if he were spring returning to earth. Letters from Rome still praised him, or so the couriers said. Yet between the lines came a colder message, like frost beneath paper. Be careful how brightly you shine. Even glory can offend the gods. In the evenings, he wrote by lamplight, the oil flickering on bronze maps and scattered scrolls. Agrippina tended the household nearby, her movements precise, as if order could hold back unease. Outside, the river Orontes moved slowly under the arches, carrying reflections of palm trees and passing clouds. It was the season when figs darkened, when soldiers grew restless for home. One morning, the general woke weak, the light too sharp to bear. His physicians came, murmured words that sounded more like apologies than remedies. The illness, they said, was sudden. Others whispered it was not illness at all. The air inside the villa changed still, heavy, listening. Servants moved with the care one gives to holy ground. Days blurred. Agrippina kept vigil at his side, refusing to leave. She wet his lips with water, read aloud the letters from the children, simple notes filled with drawings of helmets, of horses, of a boy's handwriting trying to be steady. "Tell father the boots still fit," one line said. He smiled faintly at that, or perhaps the wind made it seem so. When at last the struggle ended, there was no cry, only the faint rustle of a curtain, the shuffle of sandals retreating into the hall. Agrippina closed his eyes herself. For a long while she sat without moving, her hand resting on his arm as if to hold the shape of warmth before it faded. Then, quietly, she rose and folded his cloak once, twice, again, until it became a square of silence on the table. The news left Antioch on the same kind of breeze that had brought him there, invisible but unstoppable. By the time the message reached Rome, the words had worn smooth from retelling. Germanicus is dead. They were spoken differently in every house: disbelief, anger, mourning, yet the sound was the same, a hush falling across a continent. In the streets, people lit candles at doorways. Veterans hung their shields with black cloth. In the Senate, men bowed their heads and said the proper lines. But in the pauses between, they were thinking of Tiberius and what silence might mean. The emperor's grief seemed measured, careful, almost rehearsed. Rumors thickened like evening fog: poison, jealousy, betrayal. No one could prove anything. Everyone believed something. In the villa by the Rhine, Agrippina's children learned the news from a messenger who could not meet their eyes. Caligula stood still the longest, holding the seal that had carried his father's name across mountains and sea. He did not cry, at least not where others could see. Instead, he unwrapped the wax carefully, as though the message might still be warm. Inside were only a few lines, formal words of condolence, signed by men who would never visit the grave. That night, the boy sat awake beside the folded cloak his mother had brought home. He traced the hem with one finger, the stitches coarse beneath his touch. Outside, rain tapped softly against the canvas of their tent, patient, almost tender. Agrippina, sitting apart, listened to the sound and imagined it as the sea between her and what she had lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "We will bring him home," she said. It was not a vow shouted to the heavens, but a promise whispered to the earth, a rhythm she would repeat with every step of the long journey back. And so the procession began. The coffin borne across provinces, the banners dipped, the roads lined with silence. Wherever the people saw her, the widow of Germanicus, black-cloaked, steadfast, they fell to their knees. They said Rome had lost its brightest star. She said nothing. Her grief was a slow drum, beating beneath the sound of hooves and wheels, steady as breath. By the time the family reached Italy, the boy's face had changed. He no longer asked questions. He watched the river Tiber reappear at the edge of the city, saw the same water that once carried his father's triumphs now reflect the dim sky of morning. The cheers that had once greeted the general's name were gone. Only the wind remained, threading through arches, whispering to marble. In the palaces, power shifted again, quietly, invisibly. The warmth that once gathered around Germanicus cooled. Agrippina, once welcomed, was now watched. At night, she folded the same cloak over her knees and said nothing. Caligula listened to the silence as if it were a teacher, the kind that never speaks, only waits. History will say that Germanicus died a hero, and that suspicion followed his memory like a shadow. But for a child, history was only the smell of his father's cloak, the weight of a letter still damp from travel, the long road home lined with faces that looked away. And for Rome, the empire of marble and echo, the afterglow of Augustus dimmed a little more, replaced by a colder light. A funeral wind moved through its corridors, brushing against torches and curtains alike, not loud, not cruel, only certain. The sea around Capri looks calm from a far blue, slow, harmless, but up close, it moves with an intelligence of its own, curling and uncurling around the rocks, like something ancient and watchful. It was here, above those patient waves, that the young Caligula was brought into the orbit of the Emperor Tiberius, a place both splendid and strange, half garden, half shadow. The villa itself clung to the cliffs as if listening to the sea's breathing. Marble courtyards opened to salt wind. Statues stared forever toward horizons they would never reach. The corridors smelled of stone cooled by night, of incense burned to disguise another kind of air, the one made by fear. Servants spoke softly. and even laughter arrived in fragments, half-formed, uncertain whether it was allowed. For a boy who once knew the rhythm of soldiers and open fields, Capri was another world. There were no watchfires, no tents breathing with warmth, no sounds of boots or rain. Here, sound moved differently, quieter, cautious. Conversations ended too soon. The servants' footsteps slowed when passing certain doors. Silence lived in the villa, not as absence but as an invisible rule. Caligula learned it quickly. Children learn such things before words. He watched which faces smiled only with their mouths, which ones looked away too late. He discovered the safety of stillness, the art of breathing without drawing attention, the habit of waiting until danger had chosen someone else. His childhood became an apprenticeship to quiet. Tiberius was already old then, older than power should allow a man to be. His eyes, pale and thoughtful, saw everything and seemed to forgive nothing. To some, he was a philosopher who distrusted the noise of Rome. To others, a tired tyrant whose weariness had sharpened into cruelty. The truth, as it often is, sat somewhere in the hush between. Caligula, young and silent, studied him as one studies a weather pattern, watching for change, learning how storms begin. Days on the island followed a slow pulse. The emperor rose before dawn, spoke with advisors, dictated letters, and then vanished into the gardens. Caligula kept close, followed when permitted. They would walk along the terraces overlooking the sea, the old man talking of the republic that once was, of loyalty, of betrayal. The boy listened, saying little. Sometimes Tiberius would ask a question too sharp to be innocent. "Do you think your father would have served me well?" The air itself seemed to wait for an answer. Caligula learned how to answer without answering, how to bow with the right weight of sincerity, how to be nothing at all until it was safe to be something again. At night, lamps burned low, their smoke tracing slow ribbons across the ceilings. In his small chamber, Caligula lay awake, listening to the tide below. It was steady, unlike people. It had no disguise. The sea's patience became his first teacher in endurance. "If I can keep as still as that," he thought, "I will not be broken." Sometimes, through the open window, the faint sound of music drifted from another hall strings, plucked gently, followed by sudden quiet. Power on Capri did not shout. It breathed in time with the surf, unhurried, inevitable. When Tiberius summoned him, Caligula moved like someone stepping into deep water, careful, calm, never too fast. In the gardens, marble pools mirrored the sky. Statues of gods stood between olive trees, their faces softened by salt and years. The emperor would stop beside them, tracing the carved veins on a stone hand. "They look alive," he once murmured, "but they do not ask questions." Caligula said nothing, but remembered the line. Later, he would understand it was not art Tiberius admired, but obedience. Letters came occasionally from his mother, still watched in Rome. Her words were formal, stripped of tenderness, caution written into every line. "We are well," one said, "and think of you daily." He kept those letters in a small wooden box, reading them until the ink faded, until the paper smelled only of the island's sea salt. It was the last trace of warmth that reached him from home. Seasons turned gently, without markers. Time on Capri did not pass. It hovered. The boy grew taller, quieter. He learned to walk the villa's corridors without sound, to nod when others hesitated, to mirror the emperor's moods before they arrived. He became a reflection within reflections, a face that revealed nothing, a heart folded small to fit inside caution. Sometimes he dreamed of the Rhine of tents flapping in wind, of his father's steady voice calling orders, of the laughter of soldiers who had once lifted him onto their shoulders. He would wake before dawn, eyes open to the ceiling painted with gods, and realized the sea was breathing below, patient and endless. There was comfort in that. It reminded him that somewhere, far beyond the reach of emperors, the tides still obeyed the moon, not men. Each day began the same way. The sound of sandals in the corridor, the faint scent of myrrh, the hush before Tiberius appeared. The boy would stand, composed, hands folded. The emperor might nod, might not, and the day would unfold, slow, deliberate, a lesson in survival conducted under marble ceilings. If anyone asked what he learned on that island, he might have said, how to keep one's heartbeat hidden, how to make silence a shelter, how to smile just enough to live another day. And so, among olive leaves and salt air, Caligula began to grow inland from kindness, watered instead by fear, by caution, by the quiet calculation that passes for safety. The sea kept moving below, as it always had, eternal, indifferent, a soft witness to the making of a man who would never again trust stillness, yet could not live without it. Rome waited, not with patience, but with the kind of stillness that belongs to animals before a storm. The air in the city was heavy, not with heat, but with listening. Every whisper seemed to travel too far. Every silence seemed to mean something. Far away on Capri, the emperor aged like marble paler, colder, his features refined by isolation. The island had become a small empire of its own, a mirror to Rome's fears. Messengers came and went, bringing lists, names accused, names erased, names to be spoken softly, or not at all. From the sea, their ships looked like slow-moving shadows, bearing news that could alter a life before sunset. Caligula, still young, had learned by then that safety lived in the margins of notice. He had perfected the art of stillness, not the frozen kind, but the measured quiet that makes others forget you are there. In halls where glances were as sharp as blades, he walked as if through fog, calm, deferential, a listener who offered no edge to catch. He had learned how fear rearranges a room. When a senator's name was read, the air changed first. Then came the ritual of denial, the long sigh of colleagues pretending surprise, the hush that followed when guards stepped forward. It was not violence that taught him, but the sound of sandals retreating down corridors after the sentence was done. Rome was an orchestra of footsteps, some fading forever, others returning slower, cautious. From Capri, he watched these rhythms unfold, like distant thunder. Letters from Rome arrived in sealed bundles tied with black thread. Tiberius read them in silence, the expression on his face changing only in the smallest ways, a lift of the brow, a pause too long between breaths. The boy, standing nearby, memorized those pauses as if they were lessons. He learned that power did not need volume. It only needed waiting. At night, he sat on the terrace where the lamps looked down toward the sea. The wind off the water smelled of salt and fig leaves. Behind him, the villa slept. Ahead, the mainland glowed faintly under the moon. Rome, somewhere beyond that faint shimmer, still alive, still holding its breath. He wondered whether his mother was safe, whether his sisters still wrote letters they could never send. The ache of distance had hardened into something quieter than grief, a patience that felt like stone warming in the Sunday. Once, a servant found him tracing lines in the dust of the courtyard names of provinces, places his father had spoken of. When the servant bowed and asked what he was drawing, he wiped the marks away and said, "Nothing." That word became a habit. It protected him better than armor. Sometimes, Tiberius would summon him to read aloud from history. The wars, the triumphs, the betrayals. The old man's voice was steady, his eyes half closed as if he were listening not to the boy but to his own thoughts echoing through years. "Power," he once said, "is not taken. It waits until the unwise reach for it." Caligula nodded. unsure whether it was warning or invitation. Perhaps it was both. When messengers brought bad news, the death of Sejanus, the purges that followed Caligula stood at the edge of the room, invisible. He watched as the emperor poured wine, then spilled it deliberately across the floor, a small gesture that made everyone else still. Even the sea seemed to quiet at such moments. The boy realized that fear could be absolute even when unspoken. It was a kind of weather that soaked into walls, into sleep, into breath. The villa's corridors became his classroom. He studied footsteps, tones, the subtle grammar of obedience. When he bowed, it was not from weakness, but design. Deference was survival disguised as humility. In a world where misstep meant disappearance, he learned to treat attention as a wound one must never reopen. The days blurred together long silences punctuated by the soft rhythm of waves. Sometimes, the emperor would ask him to sit nearby while he dictated letters. Caligula listened, memorizing phrases. "We regret to inform you. The Senate will deliberate. Justice must be seen to prevail." Words that dressed cruelty in ceremony. He wondered how many men had heard those same sentences before the door closed behind them. Outside, the olive trees turned silver in the wind. Birds wheeled and vanished into the cliffs. Life went on. Even here, even under the slow weight of watching, Caligula began to understand that survival was not the absence of danger, but the ability to breathe beneath it without making a sound. Years passed this way, not counted, but endured. The boy's face thinned, his gaze steadied. Servants who remembered him as a child began to bow lower, unsure why. He had learned to reflect power, the way water reflects the sky, showing everything, revealing nothing. When at last Tiberius looked at him and said, "You are nearly a man," Caligula only inclined his head. The compliment was not a gift. It was a measure. He felt it like the shadow of a crown he could not yet touch. And still, Rome waited unseen beyond the sea, holding its silence like a lungful of air it dared not release. The city's pulse slowed, its torches burned lower, its walls leaned inward as though listening. Somewhere, within that hush, history began to turn its next page, quietly, like someone trying not to wake the house. Morning broke over the Bay of Naples with a softness that felt almost merciful. The sea, so long the silent witness to Tiberius's reign, glittered as if shaking off a shadow. On Capri, the old emperor lay still, his breath gone, his will signed, his power waiting for the next set of hands. Around the villa, servants moved in slow disbelief, speaking only when they had to. Some crossed themselves, others simply stared toward the horizon, where sunlight had already begun to gather over the mainland. When the news left the island, it traveled like a sigh finally released. Across the water, Rome exhaled. At first, it was rumor that the old man had died in his sleep, that the gods had taken pity, that his long rule had ended as quietly as it had ruled. Then came confirmation. Tiberius, emperor of Rome, was no more. The Senate sent envoys. The people poured into the streets. The air itself seemed to lighten, as if the city had been holding its breath for years, and now could breathe again. In the Praetorian camp, armor gleamed like dawn. The guard, who had learned to survive under suspicion, now found their allegiance shifting with the tide. They had watched Caligula grow from boy to man, silent, careful, watchful. Now they saw something else in him: youth, familiarity, the promise of renewal. When their commander, Macro, raised his voice, it carried easily over the crowd. "Hail Gaius Caesar, son of Germanicus!" The words spread like a warmth through the ranks. Swords struck shields, not in threat but celebration. The sound rolled through the camp like thunder made of joy. Caligula bowed his head slowly, reverently, and when he looked up, he smiled the kind of smile Rome had forgotten existed. By the time he reached the city, spring had arrived in full. Blossoms dusted the forum. The Tiber reflected a sky so blue it felt like a promise. People lined the streets, throwing petals, lifting their children onto shoulders to see him pass. They called his father's name, then his, blending them together as if the dead and the living walked side by side. "Germanicus's son!" they shouted. "The boy from the Rhine!" Caligula raised his hand in greeting, not with the stiffness of command but the open palm of gratitude. The horses clattered over the stones. Sunlight flashed off polished armor. Musicians followed, their flutes weaving through the cheers like birdsong. The city, once cautious and grey, bloomed again in sound. At the Senate, Caligula spoke gently. His voice, clear but unhurried, carried none of the coldness people had feared might echo from Capri. He thanked the gods, honored Augustus and Tiberius, and then, with a quiet breath, turned the page. "Rome," he said, "has suffered enough from fear. Let us now be governed by trust." In the days that followed, he opened the prisons, recalled the exiled, restored property, long taken under Tiberius's decrees. Families were reunited. Letters once confiscated were returned unopened. Markets reopened with laughter that had been missing for a generation. Taxes were lowered. Grain was distributed freely. The city began to smell of bread again. At night, lamps bloomed across the streets like small constellations. From above, it must have looked as if the stars themselves had fallen into the city to celebrate. Fires burned on the hills, not of war but of feast. Children ran through colonnades, their laughter echoing off marble. Old men wept openly, saying they had lived long enough to see mercy again. Caligula rode among them not as a distant figure, but as one of their own. He greeted veterans by name. He paused at temples to lay wreaths. He ordered new games for the people, grand but kind. In the amphitheater, when the crowds cheered his name, he did not speak. He only smiled and let them shout until the echo turned into song. It was as if Rome itself had been reborn not into splendor, but into relief. The marble seemed warmer, the fountains louder, the sky more forgiving. Even the Senate, once heavy with fear, began to speak with lighter tones. Macro, the commander who had raised him, stood beside the throne like a pillar of sunlight, proud and protective. In the imperial chambers, portraits of Germanicus were cleaned and rehung. Caligula ordered fresh flowers placed before them each morning. He spoke of his father often, calling him not the hero but the good man. That word good felt new in Rome, like green growth breaking through stone. For a moment, history paused. No purges, no decrees, no executions, only parades and prayers. The hum of a city learning to breathe again. Hope, long exiled, came home quietly and sat at the tables of the poor. Musicians played in courtyards. Bakers stayed open late. Strangers shared wine as if the whole empire had awakened from a long and haunted dream. No one could yet know what years would follow, how swiftly joy can turn to echo. But for now, the light was clean, the air forgiving, the people free of dread. Even the statues of the gods seemed to soften, their stone eyes almost kind. That night, when the last torches dimmed and the city settled into its first easy sleep in decades, the river moved through the darkness with a sound like deep breathing. Rome, for the first time in a lifetime, had exhaled. Summer came gently that year, as if even the weather wished not to disturb the peace. Rome was still glowing from celebration garlands on doorways, laughter spilling from taverns, fountains shimmering like liquid glass. It was as though the city had learned, at last, how to breathe without fear. Then, one morning, the emperor did not appear. At first, it was nothing a rumor in the forum that Caligula had taken ill. Courtiers whispered that it was exhaustion, that he only needed rest. But as days folded into weeks, the whispers deepened. The lamps in the palace burned later. The physicians came and went without expression, and the sound of prayers began to hum outside the walls. He had fallen to a fever sudden, fierce, and inexplicable. It struck like a hand out of darkness. For days, his body burned and chilled in turns. The courtiers moved through the corridors in silence, careful not to let hope or despair show. In the streets, people gathered at temples, lighting candles until the marble steps glowed like dawn. Mothers prayed, soldiers wept, and the city waited the way one waits for the tide to turn. There was no announcement, no decree, only the slow measure of hours, the closing of a curtain, the faint sound of water poured into a basin, the smell of crushed herbs in a bowl of steam. Sometimes the emperor spoke, sometimes not. His eyes wandered as if through a fog. He called for his sisters by name, then for his father, as if time had folded back to childhood. Outside, Rome held its breath again. Macro, the commander of the guard, kept vigil outside the door. Senators arrived in solemn clusters, offering prayers to Jupiter and vows of sacrifice. Take us instead, some said, a formula spoken in desperation, but one the city repeated with sincerity. When word spread that he might not live, the weeping in the streets sounded almost like rain. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the fever began to fade. One morning, the chamber doors opened, and a whisper went out. He has risen. The news ran faster than any messenger down alleys, across bridges, into marketplaces. Bells rang, people embraced, temples filled with offerings, doves released into the sky. The city that had once mourned Germanicus now rejoiced for his son. Caligula stepped out to greet them, pale and thin but smiling. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, a little slower, a little distant, as though each word came from a greater depth. The crowd answered with tears. They had almost lost him, and in their relief, they loved him more than ever. Yet something had shifted, faintly, like the temperature of a room. The emperor who returned was gracious, but his eyes did not rest as long on faces as before. His laughter was careful, his words measured. He thanked the gods publicly, honored the Senate, promised games for the people. Everything was as it had been, and yet, beneath the rhythm of daily joy, a new stillness gathered. It was not cruelty, not yet, only distance. When he walked through the palace gardens, servants bowed lower, though he had not asked them to. Music still played in the courtyards, but the notes seemed softer, hesitant. The same sunlight shone through the same windows, yet the air held a chill that could not be explained. Some said the fever had taken something from him, a spark of warmth, a trace of ease. Others whispered that it had given him something instead, a second sight, a sense of how fragile affection truly is. The man who had once lived in fear of power now carried it like a weightless cloak, beautiful and invisible. In private, he spoke less. When he did, his tone was kind, but somewhere behind it lived an echo of silence, the kind born from surviving a great solitude. At feasts, he would smile at the jokes, lift his cup, and then seem to drift away for a heartbeat too long, as though remembering the fever's stillness. People noticed, though no one dared to name it. They told themselves he was tired. They said that even gods could be changed by illness. They said what comforted them most, that he would return fully, that the warmth would come back. And indeed, on the surface, it did. The festivals resumed, bread was distributed. The emperor walked among them again, radiant in his white robes. But those who stood close enough could see it, the faint pause before each smile, the distance in his gaze, as if some part of him still stood in the quiet between death and dawn. Rome loved him still, Perhaps it loved him more for his fragility, for seeming, in that season, almost human. But the air in the palace had changed. The servants did not know why, only that they whispered more softly now, and that the light in the corridors seemed a little cooler when he passed. No decree marked this change. No act announced it. It was not thunder that transformed the empire, only temperature, a degree less warmth, a degree more watchfulness. In the heart of that subtle shift, history took a quiet breath, uncertain of what it would become. Evenings in the palace had become their own season, not marked by calendars, but by the slow rhythm of footsteps and the smell of oil lamps burning late. The great marble halls no longer rang with laughter. They glowed instead with a gentler kind of silence, the kind that listens for meaning in every breath. At dinner, the long tables gleamed under rows of candles, each flame trembling slightly as if uncertain of its place. Senators, equestrians, relatives, all gathered with careful grace, their faces composed in polite attention. To an outsider, it looked like harmony. To those seated there, it felt like ceremony, a choreography of survival performed night after night. Caligula sat at the head, his posture easy, his voice soft. He was rarely unkind, but his moods moved like weather shifting without sound, leaving warmth or chill in their wake. When he smiled, the room brightened. When his gaze lingered too long, conversation faltered, as though words had lost their courage. The courtiers learned to speak in half tones, to offer compliments that could not offend, to laugh only when he laughed first. Each sentence passed across the table like a delicate object, handled with both reverence and fear. Even small gestures, the pouring of wine, the breaking of bread carried weight, because in quiet rooms, everything matters more. Sometimes, the emperor asked for stories. "Tell me," he would say, "what you saw today." And so they spoke of races, of senators' debates, of omens glimpsed in the marketplace. He listened, fingers tracing the rim of his cup, as though drawing circles around their words. Then he would look up and say something simple, interesting, or perhaps the gods have their humor, and everyone would nod, relieved that the moment had passed without harm. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors in palaces. They drifted like drafts through the corridor's light, untraceable, always changing shape. Someone had offended the emperor with a careless remark. Someone else had fallen suddenly from favor. A cousin no longer attended feasts. An advisor's villa had grown too quiet. None of it was certain, but in a place ruled by glances, uncertainty was enough. In such a world, even kindness could feel dangerous. When Caligula laughed warmly with one man, the others looked away, pretending not to notice. When he praised a senator's wife for her poise, her husband went pale, unsure whether it was blessing or warning. Words that once meant comfort now trembled with double meanings. Yet there were moments, real ones, when gentleness returned. He would speak of his father again, of Germanicus, and the room would soften. He would remember a campaign song, hum a fragment of melody, and for a heartbeat, everyone felt safe. There were nights when he ordered extra bread to be sent to the poor, when he paused to feed a bird that had wandered into the hall, when he smiled not as emperor but as a man remembering light. Those moments kept the others loyal. Hope, even thinly woven, binds more tightly than fear. Among the guests, some truly admired him. Others only learned to imitate admiration until it became real. Human hearts adapt. They find warmth wherever they must. Behind the scenes, the household hummed with quiet labor. The servants who trimmed wicks, polished cups, refilled goblets before they were half empty. They saw everything, heard everything, and spoke of nothing. They could tell, by the way a voice rose or fell, whether the night would end in laughter or in cold silence. Their small rituals, smoothing the tablecloth, straightening a chair, were prayers for safety. Outside, the moon drifted over the city. The Forum slept under its pale light, and the river glided past, whispering to bridges that had heard every secret of Rome. In the palace, the banquet continued slow, candlelit, full of careful words and glances. Sometimes, Caligula would stand, cup in hand, and the whole room would follow his lead. To Rome, he would say softly, to its peace. And for a moment, it felt sincere. But sincerity is fragile under marble ceilings. It flickers like the flame of a candle when the door opens and a draught enters unseen. After each meal, the guests departed through corridors lined with shadow. Their sandals whispered over the tiles. No one spoke until the gates closed behind them. Only then, outside, under the open sky, would they breathe freely again. And still, even then, the silence followed them home. History remembers rulers by their cruelty or mercy, but there is another kind of power that leaves no mark. The quiet presence that changes the temperature of a room. The gaze that teaches everyone to measure their own laughter. Under that soft, shifting light, Rome's most powerful men learned to live as if every candle had ears. In every age, even uneasy ones, there are hands that keep building. While the Senate whispered and the court measured its own silences, Rome's streets still filled each morning with the sound of hammers and carts, of men calling to one another across scaffolds. Beneath the politics, life kept its steady rhythm, water drawn, bread baked, walls repaired. Empires might tremble above, but at the ground, stone still met stone. Caligula's reign, for all its shifting moods, gave Rome such moments of quiet usefulness. The aqueducts that began under his predecessors grew longer, reaching farther into the countryside. New channels carried clean water into districts that had known only dust. Fountains that once ran dry began again to sing in courtyards. The sound of falling water became the gentlest sign of order, a reminder that mercy could exist even without kindness. Along the coast, ports were expanded. Ships that had waited weeks for space to dock now unloaded beneath fresh-cut cranes and smoother piers. Warehouses rose where marshes once had been, their stones fitted by hands rough from labor, not power. Grain from Egypt, olives from Hispania, wine from Gaul, all found their way inland faster, feeding the city that never stopped hungering. These were not the works of emperors alone, but of thousands unseen. Men with sun-cracked shoulders, women carrying mortar, boys running messages between builders, each name forgotten, but their touch still visible in the joints of the walls, in the curve of an arch, in the steadiness of what endures. Sometimes, the emperor would ride to see these works himself, not as a planner, but as a spectator to his own age. He would stand beside the new aqueduct, watching the thin thread of water begin its long descent toward the city. Even the smallest current, he said once, must find its level. The engineers nodded, not knowing whether he spoke of water or of power. For a time, there was a kind of grace in these efforts, a simplicity that asked for no applause. The workers built because they were paid, but also because building meant stability. A wall was a promise, a bridge, a kind of faith. Rome, despite its unrest, seemed to remember that civilization was not written in marble decrees, but in the patient shaping of stone. In the evenings, after the work was done, the builders sat by the half-finished arches, their voices low. They spoke of wages, of weather, of home. Sometimes they told jokes about senators, harmless ones, meant to ease the long day's ache. From the hills, the aqueducts looked like pale ribs stretching toward the horizon, carrying the lifeblood of the city. They glowed faintly under sunset, beautiful not because of wealth, but because they were honest. Water has no politics. It flows wherever gravity allows. And so, while Rome argued and conspired, water simply moved clear, obedient, essential. It touched the poorest alleys and the grandest fountains alike. It cooled the stones of temples and the faces of children. It made bread rise and gardens bloom. It carried dust away from thresholds and soothed the city's fevered skin. The laborers may not have known it, but in their rhythm, lifting, laying, shaping, they practiced something holy, the restoration of balance. Every brick placed was a small defiance against chaos. Every drop of water that reached a thirsty mouth was a quiet victory over decay. History, when it remembers, often keeps the names of emperors and forgets the ones who made the empire stand. But perhaps the truest memory is not in marble statues or triumphal arches. It is in the sound of running water, still echoing through Rome 2,000 years later, in fountains where children laugh, in wells where strangers meet. For all the shadows of his reign, Caligula left behind these small mercies, the ports that endured, the channels that still carry water to the city, the proof that even flawed hands can leave something pure behind. When night fell and the workers went home, the stones they set remained warm for a while, holding the heat of the day, the quiet gratitude of matter shaped by effort. And in that warmth, Rome continued to live. It began quietly, as most declines do, not with thunder, but with numbers. Ledgers whispered what courtiers would not say aloud. The treasury, once full from years of tribute and conquest, had thinned to echo. Gold that once poured through the capital like sunlight now moved in careful drips. The empire's appetite for games, for monuments, for generosity had exceeded even Rome's means. At first, there was disbelief. The city had never imagined itself poor. Its markets still shimmered with imported silk. Its feasts still stretched through the night. But the arithmetic beneath the music had changed. Lavishness had become habit. Habit had become demand. And demand at last had met its limit. The accountants sent reports sealed in red wax. Advisors bowed deeper. The emperor frowned, then laughed, then said, softly, "Then we shall fill it again." He did, only not with wealth freely given. The confiscations began without ceremony. A letter, a messenger, a door knocked at dusk. A senator's estate reassigned to the treasury. A merchant's villa inspected, its keys requested, for the people's good. Sometimes the accused were present when the decree arrived, sometimes not. Property changed hands as easily as breath. In the great archives, scribes worked late into the night, copying inventories, statues, jewels, vineyards, furniture, names. They wrote until their fingers cramped, while outside, the city went on, as always. Bakers kneaded dough before dawn. Water sellers shouted their routes. Mothers called to children over balconies. The machinery of daily life never paused, even as power rearranged itself above. Rumors drifted like ash. No one spoke of executions, there were few, and those discreet, but everyone felt the air grow cautious. Men spoke more softly in the forum. Wives avoided eye contact at the baths. The walls seemed to listen. Fear had a way of moving faster than truth, carried in the pauses between sentences. At the palace, the mood thickened. Courtiers counted their gestures, their gifts, their friends. The same men who once praised extravagance now praised thrift. The same voices that toasted generosity now spoke of restraint. But the music of caution always plays one note too long. Every attempt to sound loyal began to sound rehearsed. Caligula listened. He did not rage. He simply watched the calm of a man who had lived too long in danger to need volume. His gaze, once warm, turned cool and exact, measuring the difference between affection and advantage. He invited fewer guests, then fewer still. The dinners grew smaller, the candles fewer. Shadows lengthened, though no one dared name what cast them. In the outer city, the markets still opened. Fishmongers laid their catches on crushed ice. Grain sellers swept their stalls clean. The Tiber still carried barges loaded with fruit and wine. Life, that oldest citizen of Rome, persisted. But even there, change could be felt in how customers glanced behind before speaking, in how silver coins were counted twice, in how conversation turned briefly to weather and then stopped altogether. Families whispered at night. They moved their heirlooms, buried their ledgers, taught their children new meanings of silence. A word could now weigh more than gold, and gold could vanish overnight. The city learned to look downward, not in shame, but in caution. And still, the empire carried on its proud face. Public fountains ran. Festivals continued, though smaller. The statues gleamed. The roads were swept. Rome, like a patient concealing its pain, refused to limp. But beneath the marble calm, anxiety threaded itself into every act. A small hesitation before signing, a longer glance before speaking. Fear, when it travels, does not shout. It moves like a shadow at the edge of a candle, widening, receding, returning. The emperor's decrees no longer carried warmth. They carried weight. The people obeyed, but the joy of obedience had gone. In the archives, the scribes still wrote. In the streets, the shutters still lifted each morning. Rome continued to breathe slowly, carefully, as if afraid of drawing too much attention from its own gods. Empires, like people, do not collapse in a single noise. They dim, they narrow, they continue, even as something essential begins to fade. And in that quiet fading, one could almost mistake endurance for peace. The northern wind had a sound all its own, not a cry, not a roar, but a long, low hum that seemed to move through armor and bone alike. At the empire's edge, where forests met grey sky and the sea pressed against the known world, the legions waited. The air smelled of iron and salt. The ground trembled faintly with the slow tread of horses. Some said they were to march on Germania. Others whispered of Britain, a land of fog, beyond sight, where cliffs shone like ghosts above the waves. No one truly knew what was real. Even the chroniclers would later disagree. Some wrote of conquest, a swift campaign, trophies paraded, standards planted in foreign earth. Others spoke of theatre, of drills staged for pride more than purpose, of orders given more for spectacle than strategy. But between these versions, the wind carried the same truth. Rome's reach had come to its edge, and beyond lay mystery. Caligula rode among the troops in a cloak too bright for the weather, its crimson edge snapping against the grey. The soldiers cheered him, dutiful and weary. They had seen emperors before, men of glory, men of fear, but this one had a strange stillness about him, as though he, too, was unsure of what to seek. He spoke little. He would pause to watch gulls move across the horizon, or stand listening to the sea's long breath. To some, it looked like meditation. To others, confusion. Power, like tide water, can turn reflective when it has nowhere left to go. The stories that reached Rome blurred fact and rumor. One tale told that he ordered a mock battle upon the shore, the legions lining up in full armor against invisible enemies, shouting to the wind. Another said he commanded them to gather seashells as trophies of victory, spoils from Neptune himself. Perhaps these things happened. Perhaps they were metaphors that grew into legend, shaped by time's slow exaggeration. What remains certain is simpler. An emperor stood before the sea, and Rome, for a brief moment, faced its own limit. The soldiers, practical men, did as told. They filled baskets with shells and sand, packed them beside their shields. The noise of clattering shells mixed with the hiss of the tide. Some laughed quietly. Some crossed themselves in old provincial gestures, half prayer, half habit. They understood that obedience was easier than explanation. At night, campfires burned along the coast like scattered constellations. The men spoke in low tones of families far away, of the food they missed, of whether the emperor would ever lead them home. The sea answered in its own language, waves folding and unfolding against the dark. In one account, Caligula watched those fires from a bluff above the beach. His face, lit by the wind-blown flame, held neither triumph nor madness, only distance. He said, softly, "The edge of the world is not where the maps end, but where men stop believing they can cross." Whether he truly spoke those words, no one knows, but they sound like something a man might say when standing before an endless sea. The campaign left little trace, no captured lands, no new provinces, only a handful of dispatches and the faint memory of a march that ended where the water began. Yet even this left its own kind of mark. The image of Rome's might reflected back by the sea, humbled perhaps by its own reflection. For the soldiers, it became a story to tell in taverns, the day they fought the waves, the day they gathered Neptune's tribute. They told it with laughter, sometimes fond, sometimes bitter, depending on who was listening. History may not remember their names, but it still carries the sound of their boots in wet sand. The winds along that shore have changed countless times since German, French, British, yet they all hum the same note of uncertainty. Empires come to the water's edge and pause, looking outward as if the horizon might speak. And perhaps it does in the salt smell, in the hiss of the tide, in the quiet lesson that even power must one day look beyond itself and see nothing certain, only the wide and waiting sea. In the later brightness of his reign, Caligula began to speak of himself in a language once kept for gods. It did not happen with trumpets. It came the way light lengthens on stone first, a hint, then a sheen, then a radiance that asks the eye to adjust. He dressed more often in luminous white. He let statues of himself rise, where heroes and deities once stood. In public ritual, he walked a little slower, as if the ground itself were sacred, because he crossed it. Some said it was vanity, others, strategy. Rome had long absorbed the gods of conquered peoples. Perhaps Caligula believed the simplest way to steady the empire was to become the altar it faced. Temples answered with stone, workshops filled with dust the color of milk as sculptors pressed chisels into marble, coaxing a young emperor's face from the rock. In porticos where Jove's gaze had once ruled, another gaze appeared similar in calm, different in origin. Priests learned new prayers in old cadences. Laurel crowns were set where the air already smelled of incense. If anyone wondered whether a mortal could hold the weight of a divine name, they kept the question soft, sending it into the smoke where it could dissolve. In Rome, many accepted the theater with a shrug. Power and piety had long danced in the same cloistered rooms. But empires are not one city. Far to the east, there was a people for whom images themselves were peril. In Judea, the temple in Jerusalem kept a fierce simplicity. No statue of God, no face, no likeness. The holiness there lived not in shape, but in space, in the emptiness, kept clean for the name no human could carve. Orders traveled like heat across a summer plain. The emperor desired a statue of himself, cast in splendor, to stand within that sanctuary. Perhaps he imagined it a gesture of unity. One empire, one cult, one gaze. Perhaps it was only consistency. If Rome was a body, then every limb should reflect the head. But to the people of Judea, the command was not unity. It was unmaking. A stone figure where no figure could be was not adornment. It was a fire set in a dry season. The governor of Syria, Petronius, received the order and walked out beneath the tamarisk shade to consider it. He was not a zealot, not a philosopher, only a Roman official with the practical intelligence of someone who has watched harvests, soldiers, and markets respond to the temperature of rule. He moved south with legions to enforce the decree, and at each stop, the fields thinned as men and women came out to meet him. They did not carry weapons. They carried arguments of conscience, faces lined by sun and certainty. Accounts differ, but a single image repeats. Crowds kneeling among their crops, saying they would rather the plough lie idle and the children go hungry than see the sanctuary remade into a stage. Some bared their necks to the soldiers, not in theatre, but in a terrible calm, as if to say, if our God is to be replaced by an image, let us become the offering so our children will not have to be. Petronius listened, the way a good administrator learns to listen to the silence after words, to the tone more than the sentence. He delayed. He wrote to Rome explaining the lay of this particular land. The memory here is long, and the covenant deeper than fear. He asked for reconsideration. He received no rescindment, only time measured in weeks. In that breathing space, another figure stepped into the story. Herod Agrippa, a friend of the emperor and kin to the people of Judea, a man able to speak in both languages, the language of empire and the language of reverence. Agrippa did not summon armies. He wrote, he petitioned, he waited for a moment when Caligula's attention might be gentler. He reminded the emperor of loyalty, not written in marble, but in hearts, the kind that makes provinces calmer, taxes surer, rebellions less likely. He set before him not dogma, but consequence, not defiance, but the human truth that faith, when pressed, becomes stone itself. In an audience lit by the flattering lamps of Rome, words placed carefully can cool a room already warming to disaster. What matters here is not who was eloquent or who relented first. What matters is that the command eased. The statue did not enter the Holy of Holies. The legions did not trample the courts. Petronius, by patience, and Agrippa, by diplomacy, turned what could have been a scar into a pause. The day of fire did not arrive. The wind that had begun to rise settled. It is easy, at the scale of history, to trace a finger along maps and call every event inevitable. But inevitability is only what we name the sum of small mercies after they have done their work. In the marketplaces of Judea, relief moved like water after a long outage. Mothers opened their clenched hands. Elders, who had rehearsed words to steady the young, found they did not need them. Bakers rose in the dark to knead. Priests beat the dust from their robes and returned to the rhythms of prayer. Not triumph relief, not victory mercy. Meanwhile, in Rome, the emperor continued to stage himself in radiance. He appeared with diadems. He stood beside cult statues. He accepted offerings as if they were petitions to a star. The court applauded. The Senate measured the applause. A figure can grow so large in ceremony that it forgets its own edges. But somewhere in that expansion, a letter from Syria reposed in a chest, and in Judea, the gates of the temple closed gently at dusk, the lamp within tended by hands that had cooled from fear. Men who love order call compromise weak. Men who love purity call it betrayal. But sometimes the plainest ethics wear the simplest clothes. Keep people safe. Protect what others hold sacred when it costs you little and saves them much. Let faith yours or theirs breathe. In that year, practicality became a kind of kindness. Soldiers slept beneath awnings instead of dying on steps. Children practiced letters instead of learning new words for grief. A governor kept his post. A client king kept his influence. An emperor kept his empire whole a little longer. The relief was not perfect. Distrust remained, as it always does when a command has come close to breaking what cannot bend. Yet the human body knows how to read reprieve. Shoulders lower, jaws unclench, eyes relearn softness. In Jerusalem, the lines at the ritual baths were orderly again. On Mount Moriah, doves cooed at first light, unconcerned with decrees. In the narrow streets, shopkeepers reopened shutters, and old men debated scripture in shade as if the sun had never tilted toward war. We remember this not to polish a difficult reign, but to honor the people who did not become ashes because someone chose the cooler path. We remember Petronius's delay and Agrippa's careful words, the patience that beat a different drum than conquest. We remember that holiness, in any tongue, wants breath more than spectacle, fidelity more than display. In Rome, statues kept rising, and the emperor's self-presentation continued to swell like a tide that did not know the moon was moving on. But on that far hill, in that city of stone and prayer, a sanctuary stayed unbroken. Fire, for once, did not learn its victims' names. And through the empire's 1,000 shrines, Jupiter's columns, Mithras's caves, the household hearths where salt and smoke climbed a softer lesson wandered, that power is strongest when it spares. For one season, the gods, however named, were not asked to choose between glory and peace. The world, so easily set alight by symbols, slept an easier sleep. Lamps burned in temples and in homes, and their small flames licked the air with the same steady tongue. Somewhere in those joined lights, interwoven across cultures and creeds, Rome felt, if only briefly, like a house where many altars could stand without trembling. It happened not with thunder, but with footsteps, the sound of sandals on marble, the whisper of steel drawn from its sheath. These were the small, ordinary noises by which an empire turned. The day was bright, the air heavy with the rhythm of celebration. The Palatine Games drew crowds toward the circus. Music and laughter carried across the winter light. Somewhere beyond that noise, in a narrow passage of the palace, the air was cooler, still scented faintly with oil and stone. Men waited there, the kind who had learned to be silent in their duty. Their faces held no rage, only decision. It was the 24th of January, in the year 41. The conspiracy had ripened slowly, like fruit left too long on a branch. Everyone had felt its weight, though no one had spoken its name. Too many nights of fear, too many gestures mistaken for threats, too many memories of what mercy had cost. The plan was not born of anger, it was born of exhaustion. When Caligula entered the corridor, he carried himself with the confidence of one who had outlived danger. He had survived sickness, betrayal, rumor. Perhaps he believed he had survived history itself. The guards moved aside as he passed. Their armor, glinting like mirrors, turned briefly toward the Sunday. Then, somewhere behind him, a blade caught the light. The act, when it came, was brief. A cry not loud, a struggle, a scattering of footsteps, the ring of metal striking stone. For an instant, the air thickened with motion. Then it fell still again, the stillness that follows a storm before anyone dares to breathe. They left him where he fell, in the narrow space between ceremony and dust. Those who were there said the body looked smaller in death, as though the weight of divinity had slipped away all at once. The emperor who had demanded worship lay like any man, his cloak pooling around him, his ring turned inward on his hand. In the nearby rooms, confusion began to ripple outward, the startled cry of servants, the distant echo of applause still rising from the games. Unaware, somewhere a lyre continued to play, unbroken, until a hand finally stilled its strings. Within the hour, the news spread like smoke through corridors and courtyards. Caesonia, his wife, was found and struck down with the child in her arms. The gesture, merciless yet ritual, was meant not as cruelty, but as closure, the severing of a line that might one day remember. Outside, the sky kept its calm, untroubled by what passed beneath it. The Praetorian Guard, uncertain of their own future, gathered in the shadows of the palace. They had served him. Now they served survival. In the chaos, they found Claudius, brother to Germanicus, uncle to the fallen emperor, hiding behind a heavy curtain, trembling, astonished to still be alive. A man more scholar than soldier, stammering before fate. History turns on such quiet discoveries. The guards, by instinct or mercy, lifted him up, hailed him emperor before the Senate could resist. Perhaps they sought stability. Perhaps they simply followed the oldest rule of empire, that the throne must never stay empty for long. In the streets, the people learned the news slowly. Some wept, though none loudly. Others lit lamps in doorways, uncertain whether to mourn or to hope. The city seemed to exhale in two directions at once, relief and disbelief, tangled together like smoke in a still room. Night came. The corridors were washed clean, the torches replaced. Only faint marks on the marble hinted at what had passed. A dark stain, the shadow of a shoe, the whisper of an ending. The music from the games drifted down the hill, thin and uncertain now, as though the instruments, too, understood they were playing the last notes of a reign. There were no triumphs, no grand pronouncements, only a quiet that settled across the Palatine like dust after harvest. The empire did not end. It adjusted, as it always had. Tomorrow, decrees would be written again. Bread would be baked. Children would chase pigeons through the same squares. But in that single corridor, narrow, sunlit by morning, shadowed by dusk, something vast had ended. The gods had not struck. The people had not risen. Power, tired of itself, had folded inward. And from that stillness, another name began to rise. The Romans had a phrase for it: damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To erase a man not through execution, but through silence. His name struck from inscriptions, his likeness defaced, his statues hauled down and broken into anonymous fragments. The empire, so skilled at building, also knew how to unbuild, how to make absence official. After Caligula's death, the chisels went to work again. Letters, once carved proudly into marble, were smoothed flat. Coins were melted, faces blurred. Records were amended with cautious phrasing. The former emperor, the previous ruler, the one whose deeds are not spoken. Rome believed that if it did not name him, perhaps the shame would fade. Perhaps forgetting could be a kind of cleansing. And yet forgetting never works as completely as law intends. People remembered, quietly. Servants told stories to each other in kitchens, not of cruelty, but of the strange evenings, the sudden laughter, the times he had ordered bread for the poor. Soldiers recalled the campaigns that led nowhere and still felt the salt wind on their armor. Mothers warned their sons not to grow too proud, using his name as a caution whispered, not spoken aloud. Even when stone forgets, breath remembers. Years passed. Claudius ruled, then others after him. Temples were rededicated, frescoes repainted. The empire's days went on, ordinary and immense. The Tiber kept moving through the city, bearing reflections of new arches, new faces. And yet somewhere beneath those waters, beneath the silten light, the memory of that earlier face remained not in marble, but in the slow pulse of story. Time does not absolve, but it softens. It turns verdicts into questions, questions into echoes. The centuries that followed gave Caligula many shapes: the monster, the child, the madman, the mirror of power itself. Each generation found in him what it feared or desired to understand. And perhaps that is what history truly is: the act of looking again, more gently each time, until the noise quiets enough for us to listen. When we speak of such lives now, it is not to defend or to condemn, but to understand what it means to be human under impossible light. We speak softly, so that the living may rest, and so that the dead, however far gone, might be held in the same quiet truth, that power is fragile, that cruelty wounds the wielder too, that every empire, like every life, eventually becomes a story told at night. And so, we return to Rome in darkness. The city lies under its long sleep, domes and roofs silvered by the moon. The aqueducts murmur as they once did in his time, carrying water over sleeping fields. The stones, worn smooth by centuries, hold no resentment. They have seen too much to judge. The river flows under its bridges, soft, deliberate, endless. It carries what remains, fragments of voices, the glimmer of old bronze, the memory of footsteps that once believed themselves eternal. Overhead, the stars hang steady, patient witnesses to all our brief ambitions. There is comfort in this rhythm the way the past, no matter how fierce, settles into gentleness. The way memory, when spoken with care, no longer burns but glows. We can close the record now, not with triumph or horror, but with a quiet breath. Because history, at its most merciful, is not about noise. It is about tending what remains, the lessons, the names, the ache, until they lose their edges and become part of our shared stillness. So we end where we began, in the hush of Rome at night, the Tiber moving like a long thought through the dark, the city breathing under its marble skin. And as the water carries the moonlight away, we promise softly not to forget, only to remember without shouting. And now, the story quiets. The names, the empires, the fires all fade into the hush of time. What remains is only breath and the soft turning of the world beneath it. You don't need to remember the dates or the faces, just the feeling that even the loudest lives become gentle in the end. Let that thought rest with you tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The music will stay for a while, carrying you softly through what's left of the night. You are safe. The story is over. Now, only calm remains. Good night.